So with that, I would like to introduce our first presenter, Julie Nelson, and she is the director of the Government Alliance for Race and Equity. Prior to that, she worked in Seattle, and she led the Race and Social Justice Initiative there in the community. She's going to tell you a bit more about what all that means, but if you don't mind, please give Julie a warm Marin County welcome.
Thank you, Jonathan. Good morning. Good morning. This feels like such a cozy way to have a conversation.
You want to like cross your leg and yeah.
Oh, thank you. This name tag has been all over the place. I think it's fallen off 10 times already. So thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here. This is my first time here, and really, you have a lovely home. I wish I could spend more time here. And thank you for the warm introduction. I want to actually start by just saying a little bit more about my background, because sometimes when I get introduced, or I'm introducing myself, and I'll say I'm Julie Nelson with the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. The government. Sometimes it's like what people think of from a governmental perspective doesn't convey warm, fuzzy feelings, does it? And so I want to talk a little bit about how it is that I came to work in government and on racial equity. And first, the racial equity piece of it. I was someone who, coming up as a child, received messages about race, had a white middle-class upbringing. All the messages that I got about race were around equality, that if you just treat people nice and if we treat people equal, then that's what we do as good Americans. And it was very much about race, it was about gender, it was about not actually acknowledging where and how inequities have been created. And so for me, as a young person, I had very much of a sense of activism, that I could see that there were inequities all over the place and that I wanted to make a difference. And so I was politically active on a wide range of different things. As a freshman in college, something happened to me, however, that kind of set me on a different path. I was sexually assaulted my first week in college, and it led to me going through, got some services, went to the crisis clinic, and dealt with it in the ways that people deal with being sexually assaulted. And then a few years later, I decided that I wanted to give back, that I wanted to really become active in preventing violence against women. So I went to volunteer for an organization. To become a volunteer on the crisis clinic, on the crisis line, you had to go through 80 hours of training, which is a significant chunk of time for a volunteer position. Of those 80 hours, 2 days were on race. And the demographic of people in the room were very much my same demographic. There was a lot of young white women in the room who were very passionate about preventing violence against women. When it came to talking about race, I have to say that there was just about every dysfunctional behavior that could play out, did play out. There were tears, there was denial, there was blame, there was shame. Everything that actually was not helpful for thinking about racial equity and preventing violence against women played out. And it was at that moment in my life that I said to myself, I have a really broad idea of what liberation is going to look like. And if we have this elephant in the room in one area, there's no way that we're ever going to make progress on any area. And so that was 30 years ago. And over the past 30 years, I have focused on racial equity, still recognizing that, of course, we have work to do when it comes to sexism and heterosexism. And there's lots of issues that we need to work on. But racial equity has really been the way that I have centered my work. Other thing about me working for government, When I was, and it's so great, I was chatting with the young people who are going to be up here in just a little bit. When I was that age, I did not imagine myself working for government. That I really did think of myself as an activist, and I had seen change take place by community organizing, advocating with government as the target. Not that change would take place within government. But lo and behold, out of grad school, I got an internship with the city of Seattle. And time is just surreal sometimes, you know? Like, I don't know what happened, you know, but 23 years later, I had been working for government for 23 years. And so when I ask the question, people in the room, would you raise your hand if you currently work for government? Oh, nice. Keep them up. Raise your hand if you've ever worked for government. And raise your hand if you use government. So sometimes I have the pleasure of interacting with someone who self-identifies as an anarchist and is very anti-government. And it's like, you know, even if that's your political ideology, you are still using government. So I think from a perspective of us thinking about what government is and does, there's a lot of work that we need to do, thinking about what the public sector is and what the public good is. We have a lot of contradictions in this country where we can think about the history of the United States, and we've got some ideas that have permeated us historically that have actually changed over the course of time. So thinking about the foundation of the country, when we had a statement, all men are created equal. Anyone remember who wrote that? Thomas Jefferson. And so when Thomas Jefferson wrote, all men are created equal, who was he including in that? White men, right. White men who owned property. And so that idea of, we can say that we've had equality as a core value from the country's foundation, and we have in some ways, but what we're talking about has shifted dramatically over the course of centuries. And so I think it's important to hold how that has shifted, for us to really think about it, and for us to be able to have a vision about what it is that we are trying to create. We also have got to be real. We have got to be honest that racial inequities are not random. They are not natural. They were intentionally created over the course of centuries. They were created by government along with other partners, but it was governmental policy that, that was passed, that things like who could be a citizen, who could vote, who could own property, who was property, whose land was whose land, all of those things were intentional laws, policies, and practices that took place that intentionally created racial inequities. And so right now we should not be surprised that we have racial inequities because they were intentionally created. The question for us is what we are going to do about it. That if in fact we intentionally, our ancestors intentionally created racial inequities, the responsibility for us is to actually imagine the society that we want to live in and to change what we are doing. And that, of course, started to change in the middle of the last century, thinking about the civil rights movement in a big way. Civil rights movement, people marching in the street, demanding change. Did government wake up one morning and say, my bad? No, it was because of people organizing in the street, demanding that government change. And we have seen amazing political things happen, things like the Civil Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, Voting Rights Act. Lots of progressive things have happened that have led to some levels of change. The unfortunate reality, however, is that we see many of the same racial inequities that we had before the civil rights movement, we still have today. And in fact, some of them have actually gotten worse. You look at wealth, the accumulation of wealth, that has gotten worse. We look at some of the educational disproportionalities. That has gotten worse. And so for us to think about sort of what it is we're doing within our communities, within our institutions that are actually going to, what we need to do to lead to change. The work that I'm doing right now with the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, we have identified what we sort of, I hate this terminology, best practices or good practices, what we see that actually makes a difference. And there's 3 big buckets. I know that's sort of bureaucratic, but we've got 3 big buckets of ideas that we talk about. And one of them is that we have to be able to normalize conversations about race. John was making jokes about it, that sometimes it can be a tense conversation. And what we have found is that part of that tension is that we're walking around with different ideas of what the topic even is. And so if we're using different terminology, we have different understanding, of course there's going to be tension in the room. So we have to be able to come up with some shared terminology and some shared understanding about what it is that we're even talking about. Some of the key ideas that we really grapple with, defining what racial equity is and what racial inequity is. We oftentimes start with the topic of racial inequity. And Amy mentioned the fact that we've got report after report that come out that look at racial inequities. We can identify where there's disproportionalities and we can share that data. The challenge with data, however, sometimes is that those reports very, very frequently come out and they sit on a shelf. And so we are not wanting to just document what racial inequities are. We need to be able to actually develop strategies to change those inequities. I want to also say that this idea of racial inequities, it's where a lot of people start, because it's like those gaps, the disproportionalities, they're big and they cut across every single indicator for success, whether you were talking about education, housing, jobs, health, criminal justice. Every single indicator for success, race matters. And so we know that there's gaps, but we also know that we not only want to identify what's wrong, but it's important for us to be able to visualize what it is that we're trying to create. So what is racial equity? The definition that we use is that we want to close those gaps, but we want to lift up success for everyone. It's not a matter of creating systems and institutions that actually you sink to the bottom, where you make things equally bad for everyone. We want to improve outcomes across the board. The Ferguson Commission report that came out, is about about Ferguson and criminal justice. But one of the pieces of data in it that actually struck me the most was around differences in life expectancy. That the difference in life expectancy in Ferguson, 30 years. 30 years. Now that is not because of a single police officer shooting and killing a single person. Criminal justice is a part of it, but across every single system, we are failing our communities. And so we have to be able to come together. Thank you. And think about transforming our institutions, our structures, and our communities. A couple of other big themes that we believe are really important for us to understand: the difference between implicit and explicit bias. Familiarity, raise your hand if you're familiar with the concept of implicit bias. Good. A lot of times implicit bias gets framed as an individual thing, whether I have implicit bias or, how much implicit bias I have. Implicit bias, it just means that used to be old school racism would see signs in the windows, would see those cross burnings. It was in your face. It was conscious. What we see right now with implicit bias is that it sometimes, oftentimes, isn't even named. Race is not named, but there are differences in impacts. And so that's where we really try and focus, is on the impacts. And so analyzing what it is that's perpetuating those disproportionalities at the unconscious level. Amy also mentioned institutional and structural racism. We're not just talking about individual acts of bigotry. We're talking about institutions that work better for white people. Policies, practices, and procedures that work better for white people, oftentimes without even naming it. It's not like you can pick up a policy and it says, you know, this is designed for white people, does not name race. But again, what we have to focus on is that end outcome. So we have to analyze what it is that we're doing that's creating these inequities. And structural racism just means that across every single institution, we have institutionalized racism. And a lot of times we like to point fingers, like, you know, oh, it's about the police department, or oh, it's about the educational system. Those are both true. And we also know that it's about every single institution. So for us to get to different outcomes in the community, we have to come together across our institutions, recognize that historical legacy that we're living with, and the fact that racism plays out across our society. And it's at the structural level that racial inequities are created and are maintained. So from when I said we talk about normalizing conversations about racial equity, that's what we mean. Those understanding of that key terminology then allows you to have a conversation about what needs to change. Lots of places that the Government Alliance on Race and Equity is working will come in and they'll say things like, well, we've got equity as a core value. It's a principle, which is good. It's a place to start. But when you ask the question, what does that mean? If there's, you know, confusion around, well, it means we have it as a principle. Having it as a principle is not enough. That for us actually to have impact, we have to be able to operationalize equity. That means in routine decision-making processes, we have to be able to analyze who is benefiting from and who is burdened by any given decision. That we have to actively insert equity, racial equity, into our decision-making processes. I mentioned data. It's not enough just to have data that is in a report that lives on a shelf. That we have to use data to identify not only where we are, but where we want to go. And have strategies that actually move us along that path. And we use data to actually measure whether we're making a difference. Third big bucket is around organizing. And I know historically we have thought about organizing from the perspective of community organizing, and community organizing still needs to take place, and I say that from a perspective of keeping government and other institutions accountable. Community has to put that pressure on our institutions. But the reality is that we're at this interesting moment in time right now. When I ask the question, the number of you who work for government, there is a big chunk of people who raise their hands. We are positioned within institutions, and we have the power and leverage to create change from within our institutions. If we want government that is of the people, by the people, and for the people, that is our responsibility. We have got to be able to create the institutions that are going to get us the outcomes that are in alignment with what our values are. So organizing is building infrastructure within institutions. So when decisions are being made, we're talking about race. There's not tension about it. It's just that's the way we do business. So those three ideas, normalizing, operationalizing, organizing, when those three things are happening, that's where we see their traction is developing, that we start to move the needle on the outcomes that we're getting. I want to come back and say the other thing that we sometimes talk about when it comes to normalizing is around creating urgency. That it's almost the opposite, that there has been so many years of centuries where racial inequity has been the norm, that now when those reports come out and we see, disproportionality in criminal justice or education, whatever the topic, we see those reports, it almost feels like we've got this collective shrug of our shoulders, like it's natural. And as I said in the beginning, racial inequities are not natural. And so for us to actually change those outcomes, we have to approach this conversation with urgency. We have to make it a priority. I was on a panel, not as comfy of chairs, but a panel a few years back where I was sitting talking with the police chief of Seattle. Different police chief then is there now, but having a conversation about racial equity. And in the audience, there was a big group of police officers. And the police chief at the time was talking about how hard change was. He kept repeating over and over how hard change is, and that change takes a lot of time. And while I understand that sometimes change is hard, and sometimes change does take time, I also believe that we create our own reality. And the message that he was sending to those officers at that moment was that change is not a priority. Just keep doing same old, and if they keep doing same old, and if we keep doing same old, we will keep getting the same outcomes. So for us to get to different outcomes, we have to be able to say, no, this is not okay. We have to approach this conversation from a perspective of urgency, and it has got to be a priority. Because what we have seen is that when we feel urgency about a topic and we make it a priority, change can take place quickly. It can take place overnight. I don't know about you, but just thinking about something like marriage equality. A couple of years ago, I would not have anticipated the way that that happened so quickly. How did it happen? It happened because we normalized a conversation, we organized, and we operationalized. We put it into action. These are not just theories. We are putting theory into action. And so when that became a priority, we saw change happen overnight. Well, maybe not literally overnight, but it sure was quick. And so we need to be able to do the same thing when it comes to race, when it comes to racial inequities. Have to be able to make it a priority. And I want to, on the topic, jumping back to what the police chief said around change being hard, I want to say that sometimes change, it's not that, so much that change is hard, but that the way in which we think about change, how each of us is positioned, that we have power and influence. Each one of us has power and influence to create change within our own little spheres of control. And so for us to create change within our own jobs, within our own lives, that's a responsibility. And oftentimes those individual changes, the changes within individual organizations, it might feel like, man, we're trying a lot of things and we're doing a lot of things. And it feels like, you know, they should be good things, but we're not seeing that as much of an impact as we'd like to see. And I want to share an example of sort of the necessity of perseverance when it comes to change. In Seattle, work across all indicators for success, but within the juvenile justice world, there had been lots of years of people making individual changes, policy changes, practice changes that were all good changes, but we sometimes refer to them as transactional changes. So within within programs or passing an individual policy, we create those transactional changes. And so, and they're good. I never mean to sound dismissive of those types of changes, but given that we're really trying to shift towards transformational change, we've got to keep that in mind, what it is that we're actually trying to do. So an example of a transactional change, for years, some data was available around disproportionality in court appearances. And so if you're a young person involved in the criminal justice system, you have a court date, you're supposed to show up for your court date. If you don't show up, it turns out that you get in even worse trouble. And so within the system, human services, the courts, and the police department, they knew that this was an issue. And so they had come up with some strategies to try and change that, get more kids to show up for their court appearances. And so I actually love the first thing that they tried to do. They sent reminder letters in the mail. By your laughter, I'm guessing that you, so what do you think? Did it have any impact? Okay, this is one of the things I love about this story because it actually did have impact. that they started sending reminder letters in the mail. 6 months later, came back to look at the data. And in fact, overall results had increased, that there were more kids showing up for their court appearances. However, they had a dual goal of increasing court appearances overall and closing the racial disproportionality. So they looked not only at the overall data, but also the data by race. Turns out that they had increased racial disproportionality. And so their goal, twofold goal, so kudos to them. Normally, government would have patted themselves on the back and said, we were successful. No, their goal was to address racial disproportionality. So they actually did then what they should have done in the beginning. They had some conversations with some youth and said, you know, what are the strategies for us to get you to show up for your court appearances? Not a single one of the young people said, send us a letter in the mail. But what they did say, two things. Transportation was an issue, and that they did want a reminder, but they didn't want a letter in the mail. They wanted a text or a phone call, not from the government. And so in response to that, the partnership developed, working with the community-based organizations, a couple of them, in fact, where they did start making the phone calls to young people. Again, track the data 6 months later, and the gap had closed. Not totally disappeared, but the gap had closed. So I share that as an example of, a great example actually, of people within a system focused on racial equity making a real change. Did that move the needle overall on racial disproportionality? Maybe a tiny, tiny blip, but not the sort of change that we're looking for. So after, you know, a whole series of transactional changes over the course of a decade, literally a decade, one of the things that is on the table right now is a new juvenile justice system, or juvenile justice center. And you know, sometimes language we use, it makes me uncomfortable even saying it, because the words juvenile justice center, do you know what that is? Yeah, it's a jail. So it's like the jail that currently exists for young people. It needs to be, it's horrible. It's, you know, really, really problematic. So this conversation around, you know, how do we redevelop the jail? And so there's all this conversation around, like, the number of beds. Can we reduce the number of beds? Can we put services associated with the beds? All those sorts of conversations, really important conversations. But because we had done this series of changes year after year, really trying to dig deep into the systemic nature of what was creating those racial inequities, my coming back to vision, what happened a few months back was the Seattle City Council actually took a vote on legislation that says that kids do not belong in jail. Yeah. So it's not a goal of shifting from, you know, 400 beds to 200 beds. It's us being clear what it is that we're trying to achieve, having that vision. And so I share that as an example, thinking about the power of the people in this room, the power of us all working within our own institutions and structures, that us doing that together is where we're going to have leverage and impact. So I feel like this is supposed to be a conversation, and I've been one of those guests at the party that takes up too much space. But one thing I'll say about the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, it really is about organizing within government. And we are so happy to have Marin County as a part of a year-long learning cohort. There's some people, Steve Kinsey is a part of the cohort, and there's other members from the cohort here today. That the power of working within institutions to transform institutions is amazing. And having people really strategize around ending institutional racism, it's amazing the work that's being done. Having a regional approach that in Northern California, having a collection of 17 different cities, counties, and a team from the state starts to change the expectation of what is possible. What is possible from government How can we have a public sector that is about the public good? And it changes the expectations of what's possible in our communities. So I feel like it's such a privilege and honor for me to be able to do the work that I do on a daily basis and to be here with you all working on Marin County. That there is power in movement, and we are, that movement in government with community is, to me, sort of such a life-affirming, liberating part of our lives. So thank you for the work that you're doing.
So thank you, Julie. That was a lot, and it was really good. A lot and really good. It's kind of like Thanksgiving dinner. Sleep it off a bit and go eat some more. So yeah, no, that was great.
You're not saying I put you to sleep, are you?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So you alluded to some of the work that the county is doing, and I would just say, I echo that. There's wonderful leaders within the county structure doing, some really, really cool things, and Steve is going to come talk a bit about that. But I wanted to get your take on what we as individuals can be doing to either support initiatives that the county is pushing, or maybe proposing new ideas to the county. What does that look like?
Wow, that's I think that this conversation around how racial inequities are created, that I think the big challenge for us is to think about the institutional and structural ways that inequities are perpetuated, and that I'm sure that people in this room have lots of ideas for what the county should be doing, what the school district should be doing, what the city should be doing. And I think the challenge sometimes is that we've got ideas for other people, and I think that for us collectively to have the most success, for us to be able to think and act and work within our own institutions, that it's when we are doing the work within our own institutions that authentic partnerships can actually develop. And so I think giving Steve and others in institutions ideas is good, and I think that sort of the reality that change happens by doing. And so for us all within our own organizations to be doing the work. And I don't mean just like your job, that we've got our jobs that are 8 to 5 or whatever the hours are, but thinking about the organizations that we work with more broadly, that are faith-based organizations, or the schools, that when you're a parent, what's taking place in your kids' schools. So really thinking about it, not just from yourself, from what's in your heart or in your mind, but actually what are the institutions where changes are being, or where inequities are being perpetuated, and to work on an institutional basis.
Great, thank you.